So, household Bentwood boxes. I'm Alasdair Mac Roibeirt. We're going to go into the history and some of the construction and the usage of Bentwood boxes. Um, you should see some slides up here. If you're not sure exactly what we're talking about here, Bentwood boxes are containers. They've been used for quite a while. There's actually evidence of them going back as far as the Neolithic period. The one on your screen right now is a shaker box, which is pretty darn identical to what you would have seen back within 14th, 15th century on up, probably even earlier. The main difference being pretty small stylistic things. Effectively, what you're looking at is you're looking at a really thin piece of wood, sometimes called a chip or a sweep, depending on what culture you're going from, that is heated and then bent to form a vessel by being um, affixed to itself. The it's shown in quite a few cultures. Some are better documented than others. Obviously, the most famous modernly we have is the shaker boxes, as you can see. But historically, you see them a lot in manuscripts, tucked under dressers or under tables. You see them up on shelves. They seem to be pretty prevalent in Scandinavian countries. You see them in German manuscripts. You also see them in some Italian manuscripts as well. Um, Not particularly relevant for a lot of us, but they actually show up quite frequently and are still in use in Japan. I believe it's called a wappa, and I probably pronounced that horribly wrong, is the actual term for it. So go ahead. What a lot of people are currently really used to seeing is for an actual snap box, or Tina as they're called, is what's pictured here. This is more of a modern use. This came into being somewhere in the 17th or 18th century, as far as I've been able to determine. It's a little shaky. They're kind of fragile things, and they're really thin, so they don't survive very well. The lids and the bases being a lot thicker, we find them in excavations. There's quite a few of them have popped up in York, but they are not specific enough to say with irrefutable doubt, oh, that right there is definitely a Tina box. That's what that was. They could, in a lot of cases, look very similar to the bottom of a bucket, or to a wicker basket, or to a slot basket. Excuse me. So it's really kind of hard to say. The ones we start seeing them later in time. These here are not documentably period within the SCA context at this point. I have found some indication of some that have lids, but they're not in this shape and they're not the self-closing style like this. These are more, like I said, post-period. What we do have documentation of is similar to this one here. This is a box that was excavated in Hedby. Exactly when the dating is a little hard to determine. As you can see, it's in pretty poor shape. It's really seen some use and abuse. Hedby was active as a major trading port and site around 800 to about 1100, and they found about 3 of these boxes, and they're actually in a museum in Germany right now. I'm working on getting some more data. These are really nice, particularly you can see that the decoration on them. It actually goes all the way around, and if you do a little bit of searching on it, you can find line drawings where they've actually mapped out the whole thing. The interesting thing about this one is it's round, and most of the earlier ones that survive seem to be round. The ones that we see in manuscripts seems to be more oval and round-ended, um, similar to the handled one that was prior to this end of the shaker ones right now. So it's really kind of an interesting question as to when the self-closing, the snap box, if you will, came into play, and I'm still kind of tracking that one down. The round ones like this, a lot of times you'll find them, they also do have a lid that will just settle right over the top of it. This one obviously doesn't have a lid with it. Whether it did or not, or was lost, it's hard to say. It's in such poor condition, whether it's been worn down over use, or the friction of having a lid set on and taken off. We really just don't know. This is a reconstruction, not done by me, of what the box might have looked like originally. You can see the scoring on it. The original one, if I remember correctly, was ash wrapped around an oak base, This one looks to be oak body and an oak top, and I would presume probably an oak base as well. Again, I just had a really nice reconstruction that I thought I'd throw up there. You can see the lines that are carved into it. If you've ever tried to carve oak yourself, you'll know that it tends to have a very pronounced grain, and trying to get a straight line as you're carving it is not the easiest thing in the world to do. So this is a pretty nicely done box. So here is a diagram of another box. This one was excavated in York, as you can see. Um, a book that I've got a copy of, the Small Finds Woodworking and Householding Wood. Um, Phenomenal book. Unfortunately, it's not currently in print, and I was lucky enough to snag one before they went completely out. But you can see this one, like the Hedby box, has got a good bit of carving on the body of it. And again, the top of it is really just destroyed or missing. The Whether it had a lid or not, hard to say, but it's also interesting if you look at the cross section of them, how regular the thickness of the walls are, which is really important when you're bending these. Personally, my method for bending is by hot water immersion. There's some that prefer steam. I've heard some that just green bend. And there are some that use direct heat, like over a fire. I've tried all of them, and I prefer the hot water immersion. Question here: that looks to be sewn in place with, and do you have a link to the pattern? Don't have that particular pattern. If you do a search for the Hedby box, it's pretty darn easy to find. Or if you send me an email after this, I can connect you to that pattern. As far as what they were sewn in place with, there's a lot of conjecture on that one. I will get to that in a little bit. As I was saying with this particular box, those again, they're carved, they're decorated. The thickness, if you have an uneven thickness on the wall, it won't bend smoothly. If you have a thinner spot, you're going to get a sharper bend. So trying to get as close to an actual circle as possible is really difficult. And if you look at the top depiction, you can see where the thinness on the inside has been tapered, so it comes in flush with the wall, whereas the outside is a full thickness and it's solid. It just makes a sharp delineation where the inside and the outside breaks. The other interesting thing I find with these is the base of them. Most of the bases that they found and looked at are actually slightly domed. And it took me a little while to figure out exactly why that was. The bottom is still relatively flat, but the actual inside of the box is slightly domed. And it finally occurred to me it's because at the time, axes were the tool of choice. You did not really find a whole lot of saws. They were invented, they were around, but they were expensive. Getting metal regularly thin, strong, and long enough to actually use for a saw, most people would not have spent the money. They weren't available, and it was a very much a skilled craftsman investment. So it usually you just don't find them. The body of this one here, that base, that dome shape, from experimentation that I've done, what finally clicked for me is if you're cutting with an axe, you're not going to get a straight line most of the time, especially something this thin. These things are about a half inch, maybe 3/8, maybe as much as 3/4, but not usually. Usually about 3/8 thick. So you've got a very thin piece of wood that you're trying to get down there, and trying to hold that while you're cutting with an axe is a little difficult. However, if you have that disc cut out and flat on the bottom, and if you're using an axe and start at about the middle and start shaving pieces down as you go, what you end up with is you're thinning it down, but you have a slight hump in the middle of it, which is really indicative that they've done with an axe. So it was kind of an interesting piece of experimental archaeology that I encountered, and just one of those aha moments you get when something just really clicks on a project. This one really, really excited me here. It doesn't really look like much, but after 6-ish years of doing these boxes and having that definite cutoff of all of the boxes had no handles, it was just a lid, and it was then you jump to the 17th century, 18th century, where You find the snap boxes where they've got the developed self-closing lids and the handles. To come across this one here was just really kind of blew my mind. This is an illumination that I dug out from a German archive, I believe it was, and this is the first one that I can find with any reliability that shows a bentwood box with a handle. Obviously, it's just a lid coming on and off. There's no way to carry it by that handle as that they're showing, but it actually is a lid with a handle. So it was just kind of one of those, giddy moments to find this one. This is what you see an awful lot of. This one is fairly late, 1620s. And it's a very well done portrait or canvas that is, they term it a chipwood box. You can see the box here, it's oval. It's very regular. In this case, you can see the squares there, which are probably flattened down instead of the more obvious stitch lines you see in some of the other ones here. And that one really brings to mind a method of construction that you see in the Japanese bentwood, in which they are cutting thin slices into the body, and they're using really, really thin. In the Japanese ones, I've seen they use strips of cherry bark, but birch bark can get pretty thin as well, and it's actually affixed to itself that way. The interesting thing to note on this one is they made very close detail. They were very precise in showing shadow lines. They were precise in showing the different sheen of the grain from the lid, from the side versus the top, but there is no indication of any kind of pegs to hold the sides to the lid, which I found really kind of interesting. Most of the surviving fragments have pegs, usually an odd number. It's almost always 5 or 7, so which is really interesting as well. But for this one to not have it, but so much detail everywhere else, really was kind of surprising to me as well. Again, we see another one here. This one is not quite as well depicted. It's a little bit later on. We don't have a definite date to it, but you can see, the shadow lines, the difference in the pieces, and you see a single peg holding the sides to the lid, but you don't actually see any lacing holding the body shut. And there are slits in the banding going around the lid, but there's no actual depiction of what was closing that. If it was, is it a horizontal stripe going down? Is it holes and it wasn't finished? It's really kind of an interesting little mystery to look at it. This is another one from a still life. It is up in on a shelf. I got a question about glued. Possible. It is possible. There is very little evidence showing how they were closed, if they were glued or just laced shut. Personally, when I make them, I glue them just because I tend to over-engineer everything and I want them to last as long as possible. And there are a number of good period glues available out there. So it could have been, or it could have just been nailed and or pegged. From this one here, it's in the Rijksmuseum, and this one looks to be an actual full-on round. Uh, it's hard to say. It is up on the shelf, but the way it's drawn makes me think that it's a complete circle as opposed to an oval. And it's also a bit smaller. It's not quite as tall as some of the others that we've seen so far, but you also notice that we've got the overlap. You can see the pegs holding the walls to the body, and you can see that there are pegs keeping it shut. Right? And yet another one, as I said, a few of them here. This one, late 14th, early 15th century. And if you look really, really close in that chest at the foot of the bed, you'll see a couple of kind of oval shapes here. One of the things that if you are a crafter of any flavor, you will notice your craft wherever you go. I also make chairs, and I constantly get funny looks and glances. We'll be watching a historical set feature, and I call out chairs as I see them. I'm looking at illumination. I see bentwood. So go ahead. And then here's a close-up there. You can see those oval boxes in that chest. That a couple of different size ones there holding who knows what. So they jump out at me now. I don't even really have to look for them quite so much. Again, another picture here. middle of the 15th century. Underneath the bench, you can see there is a bentwood box down there on the bottom. This one's a little interesting because it's got the X-shaped closure. So it's not the straight line of stitches that you see in a lot of the other stuff, but this particular one, you see there's an X both on the lid and on the body of them. So, and a slightly better picture of it with some cloth or something sticking out of it. Could be a sewing kit, could be something family heirloom wrapped in some cloth. It's no idea what's in there, but it's interesting. Okay, so those are the pictures that we got into. Now we kind of go over to some various discussion. I had hoped to have video to show on some of this, but I ended up not having time and the weather didn't cooperate. So the basic consideration of these things is they are made of a single piece of wood cut very thin and then heated and bent around itself. Sure. We'll grab a hands-on display here because strangely enough, I have a number of them laying about. And usually in my case, I go for around 1/8 of an inch thick, or roughly, I believe that's about 2 millimeters, if my metric is up. So here is an example of one that is, again, it's an oval, and it's about that size. And if you look close, you'll see that there's just a couple of little ties in there, keeping it closed. And it just, okay. And then just inside. And you can see those are some fairly thin walls. This one's actually made of pine, and the top and the bottom are padauk. So it's a lot more fancy than a lot of them that we see digging out. Ash is a really, really good wood to bend for it. It takes the heat, it takes the bending. But so part of the quest for these is how do you get this thin piece of wood? Modernly, it's really a lot easier to do. And table saws, blurry feed. I don't know if you can clean that up at all. No. It's just a camera, unfortunately. Yeah, and the internet's being a little taxed, so I'm afraid not. However, if you ever want to see them in person, look me up at any event. I will always have at least one or two floating with me. So you're getting ahead of me there. Hold on. I'm working on it. So my process normally is first off selecting your wood. You want something that is going to be sturdy but is going to be flexible. So my favorite wood to bend is ash. If I can get it, air dried ash is definitely better. Anytime you get kiln dried, it's going to make it a little bit more difficult because you have to soften the wood. So I will find a nice piece of straight grained ash at my local lumber yard with no knots. You want as smooth and as straight grain as you can possibly get. If you can see the grain in here, I'll move it a little closer. It is a little bit wavy, but it is running mostly parallel with the body of the box. It is not running in any crazy directions. The more interesting pattern grain will make it much prettier to look at, but it makes it much more difficult to bend. And some woods are just impossible to bend. So I picked my ash out. I found a really nice piece. I'll bring it home. Usually my boxes are between 4 and 6 inches tall. So I will take the box, I will make sure I have square edges, and then I run it through a table saw to cut slices off that are, like I said, around 1/8 of an inch thick. Usually with my saw, I've got a 10-inch saw, so I have to flip it a few times and then run it through a drum sander to get it flat and uniform thickness. Once I've done that, I've got a tank that I use. It's a half of a hot water heater cut longwise that I'll throw it in water for at least 12 hours, usually overnight, call it good, and then heat it up. I use a 3-burner camp stove underneath my propane or my water heater tank. Enough water in there, about 4 inches, and then I use some weights to keep the wood submerged. I'll bring it up to a temperature that is uncomfortable to stick my hands in. You don't want it boiling. Lightly steaming is nice, and you're really you got to play with it and get a feel for it. I usually give it about 10 minutes in the heat, and then I will pull a piece and I'll check and see how flexible it is. You want to be able to bend it a bit, um, and not get a ton of resistance. It needs to be soft enough that it is going to bend around your form without splitting or cracking. Some places I've seen that have done them, you can actually use a backer, like a thin piece of metal flashing or even canvas to give some support to it. But if you get it to the right temperature and don't overheat it, you can actually bend it completely by hand. Now to get some of the questions there, yes, I use a mold. My research has indicated there's a couple of different ways that it could or would have been done. The easiest is to take a mold and stick your wood in there and wrap it around the mold and then secure it around the mold. I use modern spring clamps and cawls. I have seen some indication that if you twine or some kind of a fabric outer was used to tie it in place to let it dry. It's an area of research, but for me personally, all of my molds are built so that they are the inside diameter of my box. I wrap my wood around it, and I usually leave about a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch lip around the top of and the bottom of the form, so that as you are wrapping it around it, you can clamp the outside of the wood to the box with that lip. In my documentation that should be available on here somewhere. All of this has pictures and some step-by-step descriptions of it as I'm going through. There should be a link to the paperwork on the Facebook event. That also links you to my blog where I kind of go into a bit more detail and a step-by-step to go through it. So once I have wrapped it around that form, and clamped it down. Usually I'll let it sit in a warm place and dry overnight. Let all the moisture dry out of it. And then once I'm ready, I'll mark where my overlap ends on the box before I take all the clamps off and allow it to come out. You're going to get some spring back. It's not going to form perfectly to the cylinder or to your mold. It's just the nature of the wood. Theoretically, if you left it longer, it might actually get a better set to it. I'm usually too impatient. I haven't done that. I tend to do it and, I'm ready to move on and make the box. So once I've got that point done is when I will then use a couple of more cawls and a couple of clamps and glue. And I will then, going off of that pencil line that I made, I'll glue the front and the back together. Clamp it down, again, let it sit and dry overnight. So once I've got that done, I've now got a completed body, and it's an oval or occasionally round shell that's solid. Making sure to try and clamp it so that you get as square of a form as possible. You don't want it conical or out of whack if you can get it. It makes it a lot easier for later on. So once I've got that one done, next step is asking about the base insert. Well, here we go. There's a couple of different ways to do the base. From some of the pictures you've seen, you cannot see the base from the outside. You're literally tracing the inside of the box onto your material, and then you're cutting that base out so it fits inside snugly. And you can glue it, you can peg it. I do both. The other method is I've seen a few of these boxes depicted as the lid and base are actual, they extend out. There's a lip has been cut into the base and into the lid so that it sits down into the box, but you have a ring of that lid material or base material exposed on the bottom. And I don't think I have any of those on hand at the moment, unfortunately. So with the base, you want to be really careful because once your body is, or okay, maybe I do. Maybe that explains it a little better than my words do because words are failing me right now. This is a different one. You can see we've got the pegs that are holding it in place. This base is actually about twice as thick as this. I've cut some of it away so that it sits down on there. And then the pegs, which actually go in through the sidewall of the box, and then they come down and in out through the base of the, you can see another one back here. Trying to do this on camera is awkward. The pins come down at a diagonal to make it as strong as possible. And then, some of the lacing on there. once the base is in place, that is pretty much the fast part of it. Your base is a matter of cutting it down and creep up on your line slowly as you're making sure it fits. You want to take a little bit off, because once you take too much off, you've now wasted that piece of wood and you got to start with another one. Let's see if that helps a little bit, maybe, maybe not. Then the top and the bottom, once they're done, they will look just like that piece there, or they'll be inset into them. Now, as far as you asked earlier about the lacing, there's a lot of conjecture about it. Some places I've seen as vague as they say, oh, it is an organic material, which is oh so helpful. When we went to Sweden, we spoke with a few people there, and one of the ladies there confirmed another one that I've heard, that roots were used fairly often. A nice supple root, such as like a birch root that is been skinned and then split in half. So it is flat on one side and then rounded on the other. And then what they'll do is they will pierce the body of that root um, based on the length of your holes and how far apart they are, so that you feed your root through the holes that you've bored in the side, and then uh, loop it back through the hole and the other. So what you end up with is effectively a chain stitch looking something like this. This one's done with cord, obviously, but if you take uh, that root and it comes out and goes back in, but you've got that hole in there and you're skipping a hole and go back down and wrap it around it. And then once that dries, it stiffens a lot, so you don't have to tie it like a cord and it doesn't come off. Bark could be used, but then that would be a birch bark box and not a bentwood box. Um, they were done, and both were fairly common, and you can find them, and they're both still done. In my case, I have a lot better access to wood to cut to the appropriate thickness than I do to find proper thickness of sturdy bark, and I'm fairly average, I think, and a lot of it is I don't take the best care of my stuff when I'm moving from events and trying to get in and out. Birch bark is a lot more fragile than actual wood is, so it's going to not last as long. It's going to get beat up and moved around. So that's the basic construction of the box. One of the things that has also been looked at is you can do instead of using a solid wood mold, a lot of people who are making the shaker boxes nowadays will actually use a couple of matched oval um, thicknesses, about an inch thick of wood, like similar to the mold, but instead of the mold covering the entire thing, they only cover around the top and around the bottom. It makes for storing a lot easier. Instead of having this 5-pound block of wood, you've got a couple of ounces of pieces kicking around, and it makes it a lot more sense to do so. Instead of having this giant block of wood that is also difficult to transport, and if you're making 5 or 6 or 7 of these at a time, or if you're trying to do any kind of a production, having that many large blocks of wood that are not going to warp or swell can be difficult. Whereas a couple of thinner pieces theoretically would make things go a lot quicker and would stack for you when not in use a lot better. Another option that I have seen discussed is, instead of wrapping the wood around a form, putting them inside a form. If you were to put a piece of springy wood inside a square hollow, it's going to spring back around, it's going to hit those sides, and then it's going to kind of arc around the corner. So you're going to end up with a square form that makes you a round container, which the number of round containers that we've got kind of makes me wonder if that's a possibility. We don't start seeing those ovals until a pretty late period. What we see is a more rectangular with rounded corners on it. Yeah. Um, Sorry, I lost my train of thought there again. Now, as far as the snap boxes, the ones that have the uprights on it that you pull apart and open them that way, again, fairly late period, if at all. More than likely, they are post-SCA period, but they're one of those anachronisms that people find to be really handy. And since it is not terribly outside of the realm of possibility, it's kind of an overlooked, and people like them, and it certainly looks better than carrying around a plastic bucket or a bag. And especially if you have something that's a fragile item, it works pretty well for keeping it pretty protected. Another thing that I found, my third form of closure, is actually what's on this one here. And this is one that I found pictures of, but could never quite find anything else. And this one, instead of having the snap box that you pull apart, this one you turn, and then the lid comes off that way. And then you turn it back, and you're good to go. So it's, again, the technology is not terribly complicated. It is feasibly period, and it's a little easier to do than the snaps. With the tension snap closure, those make them really difficult to actually open and close for some people because there's a lot of tension. Question: would it be possible to make the base out of the Bentwood as well? No, you don't have enough strength there, and you need that thickness to anchor the body as well. There's no way to make it like a solid closure, like a globe or anything like that. You're looking at different pieces, and the solid base gives it rigidity and structure. It keeps it from instead of bending like this. If you didn't have that base, it would bend like this, but then the sides would also do the same, and it would just you'd either lose your bottom or it would crack. So I don't see any possible way you could do that. Um, so that is kind of a nutshell. It is a very abbreviated rundown on how I do my process. There are a lot of good books out there that you can find on bending. As I said, some people do steam. I have tried steam bending, and it does work, but I have found for my personal taste, one, it's a little more dangerous because you've got really hot water, you've got steam flying everywhere, and it tends to fog everything up really quickly. Plus, you need to keep your wood at temperature for a lot longer, and that uses a lot more fuel. In trying to cultivate a possible medieval mindset on how to build these boxes, fuel and speed was something I considered. When I say fuel, the difference in bringing a large tub of water up to a simmering temperature or a steaming temperature, not steaming, I guess simmering is the word I'm looking for, and keeping it there for 5 to 10 minutes is a lot less fuel intensive than bringing a thing of water up to boil and keeping it there for 10 to 20 minutes. You also have the problem of, to steam, you need to have an enclosure. So you need to have a steam box and a fairly large dedicated chunk of material there that you don't want to have too much pressure built up, or you now make a steam-powered bomb, which can be not exactly the way you wanted your day to end. The other method that I've seen people discuss is direct heat. If you soak your wood and then you hold it, some people just hold it over a fire to get direct radiant heat. I have not seen it really be effective. The other one that I've seen is to use a metal rod or a pole with a heating element inside it, and then you bend the inside around that. I tried it. I couldn't get a whole lot of consistency with it. I found that for my personal taste, dunking it in hot water and using it that way was my best method. It was the best outcome, as well as the best balancing of resources that I was using. There are a few different things you can find. Fine Woodworking put out an entire magazine just on steam bending. A lot of people will use it for doing things like chair spindles or legs used sometimes in more modern furniture. You also find steam bending used for boat building, and we get a lot of our information from there as well. There is a book put out by Lost Art Press called Woodworking in Estonia, which does cover a good bit of bending wood, as well as just a wealth of knowledge on folklore. It does not obviously document it back into period techniques. We don't really have any of those, but what it does give you is a lot of anecdotal evidence, and they talk about the way that it's always been done and that the old timers had done. They discuss when to fall trees and what time of the year, what conditions you're looking for looking for the best materials and what kind of properties you'll get. They also do discuss bending wood in there. Their big thing is they fell the tree, they split the tree, and they actually bend the wood green pretty much immediately. One of the ones that pictures it in there is making hoppers that are about 4 inches or 4 foot across for winnowing grain and things. I mentioned earlier when I produce my wood, I am using a table saw to cut it. Hold on, question here. Have I talked with Jessica Smith Carlock from Summit? She's been doing the bark boxes, which seem to be from earlier. I'm wondering if there's a continuity of technique. Not really. I have talked to a few people. There aren't a lot of people that are doing bent wood boxes. The bark boxes are not as sturdy, and it's not quite the direction I'm going from. I don't have the access to the right kind of trees to get the right kind of bark consistently, whereas I can go to a number of different lumber yards to pick up a bendable wood to use. I said ash is my favorite. I've also successfully bent oak. I've bent pine. I have on occasion bent some harder woods like Paduke and Red Heart, but they are absolutely a bear to get them to bend. They're just so hard. They're more brittle. They tend to snap. A lot of the documentation that I have found, not really, is I found a conservation thesis by a lady who was doing her doctoral on conservation of crafts and skills, and she specifically did her thesis on bentwood, and she discusses a number of different methods and means, some of which parallel things that I've learned fairly well, some of which gave me some other ideas to look at. Um, Sawing is going to be the easiest way for most people to get the thickness of the board that they want. The other methods, splitting is definitely a method that is possible. I've experimented with it and haven't had a whole lot of luck with it. I suspect primarily due to the lumber. You need to have a good eye for exactly what kind of wood you're looking for, which is something I'm still learning, trying to spot smooth, straight grain, fine grained wood while it's still in tree form with bark on it is a learned skill. I have tried with maple, I have tried with fir, and directly from the tree, and have found that they don't release smoothly and flat enough. I've been using an axe, wedges, and a splitting froe to try and get them down, and I've had some luck. I've gotten some thinner pieces out. Part of it is not reading the tree properly. Part of it is these boxes were produced in a time when there was a lot more old growth availability to people. That's what it was. It wasn't the second growth that we've got now. So finding the right wood is a challenge, and it's definitely a lot more cost effective for me to go buy pre-done wood, even if it is not optimal for bending capability or characteristics. So, but it's a continuing, ongoing process, and I am always happy to discuss it with anyone that has any ideas. What about cedar? Was a question. Cedar is not one that is documented in European historical boxes. However, native bentwood, specifically up here in the Pacific Northwest, they do have a tradition of bending cedar boxes and can get a very smooth, straight grained wood out of it that works pretty well. I have had a few pieces that I've experimented with, none of which are long enough to actually bend from, that have given me some remarkably smooth results. That I've been on the lookout for some cedar logs at this point. Again, the hard part is going to be finding the stuff that's got the old growth that I can split out the material to go with and try it. It's on my list of to-dos. I just haven't gotten around to it just yet. So that's kind of my overview and what my my process and things to think of are. Does anyone have any questions at this point or anything that's jumped to mind that they haven't already asked? let's see. It doesn't look like the pictures in this Zoom are not in the handout that were listed. Can they be had? Uh, I can get you copies of them. Again, this video will be available online. Got somebody waiting. And I can get those to you. Yes, if you send me an email after this, I'll put them in there and zip them up and send them to you. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I'm not seeing a whole lot. I do want to thank everybody for showing up and letting me babble at you. I've been working with these for several years now, and they are definitely a kind of a passion of mine. Maybe a bit more so than chairs used to be. They're one thing. They're a lot smaller and easier to store when I've got a bunch of them. If you have any questions or you are looking for any information that I mentioned that's not there, please feel free to get a hold of me. I'd be more than happy to share that. And if you give it a try and you make something, let me know. I would love to see what other people are doing. These are something that they're not huge out there, but they are common enough in records that we're seeing that they seem to have been a kind of a fairly common enough thing to people to have seen, and they're really nice to see to kind of spiff up your campsite a little bit. Looking at the Headby box, the Headby box is a really nice one. I would like to get more information about it. Unfortunately, they haven't put a whole lot out there. There are some people that have been doing some of the information, some reconstructions on them over in Europe who have some better information on it, though. So, thanks very much, and y'all have a nice night.